For Marco, a 19-year-old gunner from the sun-drenched hills of Sicily, the machine he served was more than just steel and machinery. It was a promise. The Carro Armato M13/40, his home and his fortress, was a testament to Italian ingenuity, a symbol of a resurgent Roman spirit. Every morning, as the first rays of the unforgiving Egyptian sun warmed the tank's hull, he would run a hand over its riveted plates. He and his crew called her Indomita the Unconquerable. It was a name spoken with the kind of faith that only young men on the precipice of history can truly possess. They believed it because they had to. They believed it because they were told it was true. The date was October 23rd, 1942. The place, a desolate stretch of sand, near a railway stop named El Alamein. A profound stillness hung in the air, a silence that felt heavier and more suffocating than the coming heat of the day. It was the calm before a storm that would not only decide the fate of North Africa, but would also ignite a painful revelation in the hearts of thousands of Italian soldiers. For Marco and the men of the famed Ariete Armored Division, this was supposed to be a day of glory. They had honed their skills in the crucible of desert warfare, learning the deadly ballet of tank combat. They were confident, not with the arrogance of fools, but with the quiet assurance of professionals who trusted their tools and, more importantly, each other. Their commander, a veteran with eyes that had seen too much sand and sorrow, had assured them that Italian courage ardor was the secret ingredient that would overwhelm the British and their new American allies. They are shopkeepers and farmers, not warriors, the propaganda posters claimed. Their systems are decadent, their machines mass-produced without a soul. Marco thought of his father, a farmer who worked the volcanic soil of his homeland with bare hands. He fought not for an abstract ideology or the grand ambitions of Mussolini, but for the honor of that farmer, for the letters from his mother tucked safely in his breast pocket, and for the 3 other men sharing the cramped, oil-scented air inside Indomita. His loyalty was to them, his family. He trusted that the nation they all served had placed in their hands a weapon capable of defending that honor. Yet, even in their hardened confidence, whispers slithered through the ranks like desert vipers. German reconnaissance pilots, men known for their stoic refusal of exaggeration, returned with unsettling reports. They spoke of a new American tank, seen in growing numbers on the horizon. Their descriptions were frustratingly vague, laced with a kind of bewildered respect. It wasn't just bigger, it moved with a predatory grace, its turret traversing with unnerving speed. They called it a mobile fortress, a monster of steel that seemed to shrug off their anti-tank rounds. To the Italian tankers, these were just rumors, ghost stories told around flickering lamps to test the nerve of green recruits. Their 47mm cannon was a formidable weapon, they believed. It had served them well before, it would serve them well again. The design of the M13/40 was, in 1940, considered perfectly adequate. It was a product of a nation with limited industrial capacity, striving to keep pace in a world hurtling toward total mechanized war. Its armor, bolted and riveted rather than welded, was thought to be sufficient. Its engine, while sometimes prone to overheating in the brutal African climate, was a familiar beast. The crew knew its every cough and sputter. But warfare, especially in the Second World War, was a relentless engine of innovation. An advantage measured in millimeters of steel or meters per second of muzzle velocity could vanish in a matter of months. By late 1942, the M13/40 was, according to some post-war analyses, already an artifact, a relic fighting in a war that had technologically evolved past it. But Marco knew nothing of this. He knew only the weight of the shell in his hands, the familiar recoil of the gun, and the shouts of his commander directing him to the next target. He and his comrades had tasted victory. They had outmaneuvered British Crusader tanks and pushed the front lines deep into Egypt. These successes created a dangerous illusion of parity, a belief that skill and tactical bravery could bridge any technological gap. It was a comforting lie, but a lie nonetheless. The desert, however, is an unforgiving place. It has a way of stripping away all illusions, leaving only the hard, unvarnished truth, exposed under a relentless sun. As the orders finally came to advance, the engine of Indomita roared to life. A familiar growl that was both comforting and terrifying. Marco peered through his narrow vision slit, the world reduced to a dusty sliver of sand and sky. He could feel the vibration of the tracks, the collective tension of his crew, the shared, unspoken prayer on their lips. They were moving forward to face an enemy they thought they understood, armed with a faith in their courage and in the steel that protected them. They believed their bravery could conquer any machine. But what happens when your enemy doesn't just bring a better machine to the fight? What happens when they redefine the very meaning of steel? In the next few hours, Marco and thousands of men like him would not simply face another army. They were about to confront a brutal industrial truth that would shatter their world, break their machines, and ultimately set them on an unbelievable path toward a revelation they could never have imagined. The real battle was not for El Alamein. It was for their very perception of reality. To understand the profound shock that awaited Marco and his comrades in the crucible of El Alamein, one must first understand the myth they carried into battle. The Carro Armato M13/40 was not merely a machine. It was the centerpiece of a carefully constructed national narrative. In the late 1930s, as Italy strained to assert its dominance, Benito Mussolini's propaganda machine worked tirelessly to project an image of formidable military and industrial strength. Newsreels, broadcast in cinemas from Rome to Palermo, showed endless columns of these tanks rolling off assembly lines. Their sharp, angular silhouettes presented as the very embodiment of fascist modernity. They were the new steel legions, destined to carve out a new Roman Empire in the African sands. This narrative was intoxicating, particularly for a nation that had long felt itself in the industrial shadow of Britain, Germany, and France. The M13/40 was hailed as a purely Italian achievement, proof that their engineers could rival any in the world. The story told to the soldiers and the public was one of quality over quantity, of sophisticated design over brute force. It was a story that conveniently omitted the fact that Italy's industrial base was a fraction of its rivals. It lacked the vast resources of coal, iron, and oil, and its factories were not yet geared for the kind of mass production that modern, total war would demand. The M13/40 was, in reality, a product of this limitation, a compromise born of necessity, hailed as a masterpiece of choice. Beneath the propaganda, however, lay a series of design characteristics that some engineers of the time likely knew were becoming dangerously obsolete. The tank's armor, for instance, was fastened with rivets. This method was simpler and faster for an industry not fully proficient in advanced welding techniques, but it concealed a deadly flaw. When struck by a powerful enemy shell, even one that didn't fully penetrate, the force of the impact could shear these rivets on the inside. They would transform into dozens of high-velocity metal projectiles, ricocheting around the cramped crew compartment with lethal effect. A crew could be shredded to pieces without the armor ever being breached. It was a vulnerability hiding in plain sight. Furthermore, the M13/40 operated with a two-man turret. This placed an immense burden on the tank's commander. He was responsible for spotting enemy targets, commanding the driver and gunner, loading the 47mm main cannon, and firing it. In the heat of battle, this was a frantic, overwhelming series of tasks that severely limited the tank's rate of fire and situational awareness. By contrast, German, British, and American designs were increasingly standardizing three-man turrets, where a dedicated loader freed the commander to focus on the single most important job, fighting the tank. This difference was not just a technical detail, it was a fundamental gap in combat philosophy. The tank's diesel engine, too, was a source of both pride and frustration. While it offered better fuel economy than its gasoline counterparts, a crucial advantage in the vast, supply-starved desert, it was widely considered to be underpowered for the tank's 13-ton weight. In the brutal African heat, it was prone to overheating and mechanical failure, turning the steel hull into an oven and leaving crews stranded in the most dangerous of circumstances. Yet, for the men who operated them, these flaws were simply challenges to be overcome by skill, maintenance, and sheer willpower. They learned to drive with mechanical sympathy, to clear jammed guns in seconds, and to fight with a desperate efficiency born of necessity. Their faith in their machine was not entirely unfounded. It was forged in the fire of early victories. After a disastrous debut during the British Operation Compass in late 1940, where poor coordination and tactics led to heavy losses, the Italian crews adapted. They learned the brutal lessons of the desert. In November 1941, at the Battle of Bir Gubi, the tankers of the Ariete Division achieved their most celebrated victory. Using clever defensive hull-down positions where only their turrets were exposed, they fought off a determined attack by 50, the British 22nd Armoured Brigade. With tactical brilliance and undeniable courage, they knocked out dozens of British Crusader tanks. Bir Gubi became a legend, a confirmation of their core belief. The Italian soldier, the ardetismo spirit, was the ultimate weapon. The man was more important than the machine. This confidence was bolstered during the fierce Gazala battles in mid-1942, where they fought alongside Erwin Rommel's vaunted Afrika Korps. But it was also here that the first serious cracks in their myth began to appear. The Americans had begun supplying the British with new equipment under the Lend-Lease Act, including the M3 Grant tank. The Grant was an awkward, ungainly-looking machine with its main 75mm gun mounted in the hull rather than the turret. But that gun was a terrifying revelation. It could engage and destroy an M13 over 40 from a distance, where the Italian 47mm cannon was utterly useless, its shells falling short or sparking harmlessly against the Grant's thicker armor. For the first time, Marco and his fellow tankers experienced the cold dread of being outranged, of being killed by an enemy they could not touch. They adapted again, developing risky tactics to close the distance, aiming for the Grant's weaker side armor or tracks. They survived, but the lesson was clear. Courage could not bend the laws of physics. Still, the myth endured. The Grant was seen as a temporary problem, a clumsy stepping stone, not the final word. The propaganda from Rome continued to assure them that American manufacturing was shoddy, their workers undisciplined, their democracy inefficient for the rigors of war. The Italian tankers, standing atop their dusty machines under the setting sun, chose to believe it. They told and retold the stories of Bir Gubi. They took pride in their ability to outfight a clumsy M3 Grant. They were the veterans, the masters of the sand seas. They believed the heart of the man was what mattered most. They did not yet know, and could not possibly comprehend, that across the ocean, a different kind of heart was beating the industrial heart of a nation that was about to unleash a monster, born not of battlefield philosophy, but of the assembly line. The M4 Sherman was coming. And it was not just a better tank. It was the product of a system that would render their courage, their skill, and their sacrifice tragically, hopelessly, irrelevant. The attack began not with a thunderous roar, but with a low, ominous rumble that grew from the horizon. It was a sound unlike the familiar clatter of their own M13s or the higher-pitched whine of German panzers. This was a deep, guttural vibration that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock of the desert. Then, they appeared. Cresting a distant dune, they came not in a chaotic swarm, but in disciplined waves, their formation perfect and unnervingly uniform. There were dozens at first, then scores, until the horizon was a solid line of them 252 M4 Sherman tanks, rolling forward with the inexorable advance of a steel tide. Marco stared through his periscope, his breath catching in his throat. They didn't look like tanks. They looked like a species of predator, their tall profiles and long cannons moving with a calculated, unhurried confidence that spoke of absolute superiority. Target, straight ahead. Range, 1,500 meters. His commander, Sergeant Bellini, barked. His voice was tight, but steady. Marco's training took over. He was a gunner, and a good one. He centered the crosshairs of his sight on the lead Sherman's hull, The tank filled his vision, a monolithic slab of olive-drab steel. It was bigger than anything they had faced before, but the principles were the same. Find a flat surface, aim, fire. He squeezed the trigger. Indomita bucked with the familiar, violent recoil of her 47mm cannon. He watched the tracer round arc perfectly across the sand and strike the American tank squarely on its frontal plate. And then, nothing. There was no plume of black smoke, no flash of an internal explosion, no sign of damage whatsoever. Instead, there was a bright, metallic spark as the shells simply ricocheted, tumbling harmlessly into the sky. A stunned silence filled the turret. "Did you see that?" the loader whispered, his voice laced with disbelief. "Misfire. Bad shell. Reload," Bellini ordered, his voice betraying the first crack in his composure. "Aim for the turret ring this time, Marco. Make it count." Another shell was rammed into the breach. Marco took a breath, adjusted his aim, and fired again. Again, the shell flew true. And again, it bounced off the Sherman's armor, with another impotent flash of light. It was like throwing a stone at a fortress wall. A cold knot of dread began to form in Marco's stomach. His weapon, the most powerful thing in his world, was useless. This wasn't a battle, it was a nightmare. Through his sight, he saw the Sherman's turret begin to turn. It wasn't the frantic, hand-cranked rotation of his own M13. It was a smooth, powered traverse, the long 75mm barrel sweeping toward them with the calm, deliberate menace of a pointing finger. They had fired twice, revealing their position and their futility. Now, it was the enemy's turn. The truth, which Marco was now learning in the most brutal way possible, was a matter of simple, cruel physics. The M4 Sherman was the product of a different world, a different industrial philosophy. Its frontal armor was reported to be over 50mm thick, but more critically, it was sloped at a sharp angle. This simple geometric feature dramatically increased its effective thickness, causing smaller, lower-velocity shells, like Marco's 47mm, to glance off. The M13, over 40, by contrast, had mostly vertical armor plates, a design that presented a perfect 90-degree target for an incoming round. And then, there was the gun. The Sherman 75mm M3 cannon was a versatile, powerful weapon capable of firing high-explosive rounds at infantry, armor-piercing shells that could slice through the M13 over 40's comparatively thin armor from well over 1,000 meters away. The Italian 47mm cannon, on the other hand, was effective out to perhaps 500 meters, but only against the thinner side armor of a tank like the Sherman. To kill this new beast, they had to survive a suicidal dash across a kilometer of open desert, all while the enemy could stand still and destroy them at its leisure. It was not a battle of courage against courage or skill against skill. It was the contest of a hammer against a pane of glass. This technological chasm was more than just a tactical disadvantage. For Marco, it was the utter collapse of his entire worldview. Every speech he had heard, every poster he had seen, every assurance of Italian superiority, it was all a lie. A criminal lie. The men in Rome, who had sent them here, must have known. They must have known their finest tanks were nothing more than mobile coffins against what the Americans were building. His loyalty had been to his family, to his crew, but he had placed his faith in a system that had armed him with a myth. In that moment, the anger he felt was not toward the American soldier in the opposing tank, but toward the leaders who had betrayed his trust so completely. He was not a soldier in a glorious war. He was a sacrifice in a tragic deception. A deafening roar and a violent concussion rocked Indomita, throwing Marco hard against the interior wall. The American shell had struck. It hadn't penetrated, but the sheer kinetic force of the impact was staggering. The air filled with the smell of ozone and hot metal. A high-pitched ringing filled his ears. "Everyone all right?" Bellini yelled, his voice strained. Before anyone could answer, the Sherman fired again. This time, the sound was different. It wasn't a dull thud against the outside. It was a sharp, cracking explosion that seemed to come from inside the tank itself. The loader slumped forward without a sound. The air became thick with smoke and the coppery scent of blood. The myth of Italian steel had just evaporated in a single devastating flash. Inside the suffocating confines of his turret, the silence was now more terrifying than the explosions. The sounds of their own useless shells striking the enemy had been replaced by the chilling reality of the enemy's power. And then, through the smoke and the ringing in his ears, Marco saw it. The long, dark barrel of the M4 Sherman, the monster that had just crippled them, was slowly, calmly, turning back toward him. In that instant, he was no longer fighting for honor, for victory, or for Italy. He was praying for the simple, desperate miracle of survival. The battlefield had descended into a slaughterhouse. What had begun as an organized armored advance had shattered into a chaotic scramble for survival. All across the desert floor, the M13, 42nd of the Ariete Division, were dying. Marco, his ears still ringing from the internal blast that had killed his loader, could only watch in horrified paralysis as the Shermans executed their grim work with methodical precision. He saw a tank to his left, Folgore, take a direct hit to its ammunition storage. The resulting explosion was instantaneous and absolute, a brilliant orange fireball that tore the turret from its chassis and sent it spinning 100 feet into the air. There were no survivors. Another tank, trying to reverse into the relative cover of a shallow wadi, was struck in the engine compartment. It didn't explode, but thick, black smoke began billowing from its vents as flames licked at its rear deck. The crew bailed out, desperate figures scrambling from the burning hulk, only to be cut down by the machine gun fire that raked the sand around them. The Italian crews, realizing their main guns were useless, reacted with the furious courage of despair. Some attempted suicidal charges, racing toward the Shermans in a desperate bid to get close enough to hit their weaker side armor. Most were destroyed long before they got within effective range. Others, like Marco's crew, tried to hold their ground, firing desperately at the enemy's tracks or suspension, hoping to immobilize one of the steel monsters. But it was a futile gesture. For every Sherman they managed to damage, 10 more seemed to be waiting to take its place. The radio, which had crackled with confident commands just an hour earlier, was now a cacophony of frantic screams, prayers, and finally, a haunting static silence as one tank after another went off the air. This was the breaking point, the moment when an army ceases to be a fighting force and becomes a collection of terrified individuals. Yet, even in the midst of this utter rout, there were acts of unbelievable bravery that bordered on madness. One name that would later become legend was that of Lieutenant Luigi Arbib Pascucci. Post-war accounts suggest that with his own tank damaged and the battle clearly lost, he gathered the last handful of operational M13s, perhaps less than a dozen, and led them in one final, desperate counterattack. It was not an act of tactical genius. It was an act of pure sacrifice. He knew they stood no chance. But his charge was intended to do one thing: buy a few precious minutes for the infantry and anti-tank gunners of the Ariete Division to retreat and establish a new defensive line. He was creating a distraction with his own life and the lives of his men. Pascucci and his entire contingent were annihilated, but his sacrifice was not in vain. He had upheld the honor of his unit in its darkest hour. From the command post of the Ariete, as his division was being systematically dismantled, General Francesco Antonio Arena is said to have sent one of the most famous and poignant last messages of the Desert War. Transmitted in the clear for all to hear, friend and foe alike, it was a final, defiant testament. Enemy tanks have broken through, south of Bir el Abd. The entire Ariete is surrounded. We are located 5 kilometers northwest of Bir el Abd. Ariete tanks are still fighting. It was a declaration that even in the face of certain destruction, they would not surrender. They would fight to the last man, the last shell, the last tank. For Marco, the end came not with a bang, but with a jarring, metallic screech. Another 75mm shell slammed into Indomita, this time striking the drive sprocket and shattering the track. The tank lurched violently to one side and ground to a halt, crippled and helpless. Sergeant Bellini, his face a mask of grime and despair, knew it was over. "Out! Everybody out!" he screamed. The driver kicked open his forward hatch and scrambled out, disappearing into the smoke. Bellini pushed Marco toward the turret hatch. "Go. Live to fight another day," he yelled, shoving him upward. Marco tumbled out onto the hot engine deck, the intense sunlight blinding him for a moment. He saw Sergeant Bellini starting to follow him. But just as his commander's head and shoulders emerged from the turret, a final shell struck the tank. The impact threw Marco clear, sending him crashing into the rough sand. When he looked up, dazed and bruised, the entire top of Indomita's turret was gone. So was Sergeant Bellini. He was alone, the sole survivor of a crew that had shared bread, wine, and dreams of home just that morning. He lay there for what felt like an eternity, the sounds of the battle fading around him, replaced by a profound, empty silence in his own mind. He was numb. The shock had stripped him of fear, of anger, of grief. There was nothing left. He barely registered the crunch of boots on the sand beside him, or the shadow that fell over his body. An American soldier, his face young and tense, stood over him, rifle pointed at his chest. The soldier said something in English, a language Marco didn't understand, but the meaning was universal. He slowly, painfully, raised his empty hands in the air. The war was over for. As he was led away, a captive in his own country's desert, he felt no shame, no hatred. All he felt was a vast, hollow emptiness. He had lost his friends, his tank, his purpose, and the foundational belief that his cause was just and his leaders were wise. He thought this was the end of his story, the final, ignominious chapter. He could not have known that this moment of utter defeat was not an ending at all. It was, in fact, the beginning of an entirely different kind of war. A struggle, not for territory, but for his mind and soul. His capture was not a descent into darkness, but a forced march toward a revelation far more powerful than any victory he could have ever achieved on the battlefield. The journey to America was the first stage of Marco's profound unraveling. He and thousands of other Italian and German prisoners were herded onto a ship in Alexandria. It wasn't an opulent liner, but a vessel of stark, functional design. It was a liberty ship, and the American sailors, with a casual pride that baffled their captives, told them it had been built from keel to smokestack in a matter of weeks. To Marco, who came from a country where building such a vessel would take the better part of a year, this was an incomprehensible feat. It was his first dizzying glimpse into the scale of the industrial power that had crushed him. The voyage itself was an exercise in surrealism. They crossed an ocean, hunted by U-boats. Yet on board, they were fed 3 meals a day. Their wounds were treated, and they were allowed to sleep without the fear of an incoming artillery barrage. The true shock, however, came when they sailed into the mouth of Chesapeake Bay and approached the port of Norfolk, Virginia. It was night, and Marco stood on the deck, crowded among the other prisoners, staring at the coastline. He was expecting the familiar sight of a European city at war, a blacked-out, fearful landscape, shrouded in darkness to protect it from bombers. Instead, what he saw stole his breath. The city was a galaxy of light. Electric lights blazed from every building. Streetlights lined the roads in perfect glowing rows. And the port itself was a dazzling spectacle of activity, as bright as midday under immense floodlights. There was no fear here. This was a country so powerful, so confident in its security, that it did not even bother to hide its light from the enemy. It was a display of dominance more intimidating than any fleet of tanks. Life in the prisoner of war camp in rural Virginia was a continuation of this cultural vertigo. The Italians were prepared for the worst: barbed wire, brutal guards, starvation rations. The barbed wire was there, of course, but the brutality never materialized. Instead, they were met with a baffling, almost bureaucratic form of decency. They were given clean barracks, new clothes, and access to medical care. But the single greatest psychological shock, the one that truly began to dismantle their entire belief system, was the food. Marco was put on kitchen duty, working alongside Italian cooks who had spent years mastering the art of creating sustenance from nothing. A handful of flour, a few withered vegetables, a sliver of meat. In the American camp kitchen, they entered a world of bewildering, almost criminal abundance. They saw crates of fresh eggs, mountains of potatoes, sides of beef, and a seemingly endless supply of white bread. But it was the waste that shattered them. At the end of each day, the American mess sergeant would order them to throw out whatever was left over. Perfectly good loaves of bread, trays of cooked meat, vegetables that were merely hours old, all were to be dumped into garbage bins. The Italian cooks protested, gesticulating wildly, trying to explain in broken English that this food could feed a village for a week. The American sergeant, a man not built for nuance, simply shrugged. Regulations, he'd say. Gotta make room for tomorrow's shipment. For men who knew what true hunger felt like, who had seen their own families subsist on meager rations. This casual, systemic waste was more shocking than any act of violence. It spoke of a country so rich, it didn't even know its own strength. This revelation extended beyond the camp gates. On weekends, prisoners were sometimes put to work on local farms to alleviate the wartime labor shortage. There, Marco saw another impossible sight. American farmhands and factory workers driving to their jobs in their own private automobiles. He watched, stunned, as a carpenter pulled up in a Ford sedan, a machine more luxurious than anything his town's mayor owned. Marco's mind immediately flew to his father in Sicily. He pictured him waking before dawn, his back permanently stooped, walking 3 miles to the fields to toil under a scorching sun with a donkey and a wooden plow. His father was the hardest working man he had ever known, yet a lifetime of that labor had not afforded him the simple dignity of a machine to carry him to work. Here, in this enemy country, it was commonplace. The question burned in his mind, a kind of moral heresy. Who was the real workers' state? The fascist regime that glorified labor but gave the laborer nothing, or the democracy that allowed a simple carpenter to own a car? The most profound lesson in this strange new world came in the form of a quiet, unexpected act of humanity. One of Marco's friends, a fellow tanker named Enzo, who had been badly wounded by shrapnel, developed a raging infection in his leg. His fever spiked, and the leg swelled, turning a dark, angry red. In the Italian army, a wound like that was a death sentence. The doctors would have done what they could, but without effective medicine, the infection would inevitably win. Marco and the other Italians prepared for their friend's death, gathering by his bedside to say their goodbyes. But the American camp doctor had other ideas. He came in not with condolences, but with a small vial of a new, yellowish powder. It was a drug they called penicillin, a scientific miracle that was only just becoming widely available. The doctor administered it to Enzo, and within days, the fever broke. The swelling subsided, the angry red faded. Enzo lived. That single act did more to defeat the fascist ideology in Marco's heart than the entire Eighth Army. They had been taught that their enemies were decadent, godless barbarians. But these barbarians had used their most advanced, life-saving medicine to save a lowly prisoner of war, an enemy soldier. This was not the act of a weak or decadent people. It was the act of a profoundly confident and, in a way he was only just beginning to understand, a profoundly powerful civilization. Every day in America was another chisel blow to the statue of lies he had been raised to worship. He had been defeated by their steel, and now he was being conquered by their kindness and their incomprehensible plenty. He had seen the results of their system, the mountains of food, the personal cars, the miracle drugs. But he still hadn't seen the source. He couldn't yet grasp the sheer scale of the engine that powered this world. That revelation, the greatest shock of all, was still to come, hidden deep in the industrial heartland of the nation that had captured him. Several months into their captivity, a select group of Italian officers and non-commissioned officers, including Marco, were chosen for an experience that would permanently alter their understanding of the world. They were told they were going on a tour to see American agriculture and industry. To Marco, it sounded like a propaganda exercise, a chance for their captors to gloat. He boarded the train with a cynical resignation, expecting to be shown a few well-managed farms and a token factory, polished and presented for their benefit. The train rolled west, out of the rolling hills of Virginia, and into the flat, expansive heartland of America. For days, they traveled through an endless landscape of organized prosperity, vast geometric fields of corn and wheat, stretching to the horizon, dotted with sturdy farmhouses and towering silos. It was agriculture on a scale he could barely process. Then, one morning, they arrived at a place outside of Detroit, Michigan. The train slowed as it approached a building so colossal it seemed to defy logic. It wasn't a building in the traditional sense. It was a sprawling man-made mesa of concrete and steel that stretched for over a mile, its roof seeming to merge with the gray Midwestern sky. This was the Willow Run bomber plant, built by the Ford Motor Company. As they were led inside, the sheer scale of the interior was a physical blow. The air thrummed with a deafening, unified roar, the sound of a million moving parts working in concert. Before them lay a single room so vast that the far wall was lost in the industrial haze. It was a river of machinery, a moving ecosystem of human effort and mechanical power. They were guided onto an elevated catwalk that ran the length of the main assembly line. Looking down, Marco felt a sense of vertigo that had nothing to do with the height. Below him, the raw components of a four-engine heavy bomber, the B-24 Liberator, entered at one end, and through 1,000 meticulous stages, evolved into a finished war machine at the other. There were no wasted movements. Every worker, man and woman alike, another shock to his traditional sensibilities, performed their task with a focused, unhurried efficiency. Rivet guns chattered like metallic insects. Overhead cranes glided silently, carrying entire wing assemblies, as if they were made of paper, and fuselages, gleaming in their unpainted aluminum, moved steadily down the line. It was the antithesis of the Italian war effort he knew, which was often characterized by brilliant improvisation and frantic efforts to make do with scarce resources. This was different. This wasn't improvisation. It was a science. It was the cold, hard logic of mass production applied to the art of destruction. And its power was absolute. An American officer, acting as their guide, sensing their stunned silence, leaned in and pointed to the end of the line, where a completed B-24, its four propellers gleaming, was being prepared to be towed onto the airfield. "See that?" the officer said, his voice casual, almost bored. "We roll a new one of those off the line just about every hour." The statement hung in the air, simple, declarative, and utterly world-shattering. Every hour. Marco did the math in his head, and his mind recoiled. In a single day, this one factory produced more heavy bombers than the entire Italian aviation industry could likely produce in a month, or perhaps several. He thought of the M13 over 40, of which Italy had managed to build only a few thousand over several years. It was a statistical truth, so overwhelming it bordered on the sublime. In that instant, the last vestiges of his old world crumbled to dust. The Battle of El Alamein was finally reframed in his mind, not as a failure of courage or a mistake in tactics, but as the inevitable collision between two different centuries. He and his friends in their riveted, underpowered tanks had not been fighting the Sherman. They had been fighting this factory. They had been fighting the American high school graduate who could design a better gear ratio, the farmer who grew so much food he could feed an army of factory workers, the woman who could expertly wire an instrument panel, and the economic system that could orchestrate this symphony of production without resorting to terror or totalitarian control. The Sherman tank was not the weapon. The B-24 was not the weapon. The true secret weapon of America was its system, a system that unleashed human potential, rewarded innovation, and generated a torrent of material wealth so vast that it could casually discard what other nations would kill for. The propaganda of Mussolini, which spoke of the decadent, chaotic weakness of democracy, was revealed for what it was: a pathetic, self-serving lie told by a small man who could not comprehend the power of a free people. Standing on that catwalk, surrounded by the thunderous roar of creation, Marco felt a strange and unexpected emotion wash over him. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't envy. It was a profound sense of liberation. A tremendous weight lifted from his shoulders. The ghosts of his dead comrades, his loader, Sergeant Bellini, could finally rest. Their deaths were not in vain, because they had been poor soldiers. They were tragic, because they had been sent to fight a force of nature with a pocket knife. They had never stood a chance. The war had been lost long before the first shot was ever fired at El Alamein. It had been lost in places like this, in the roaring heart of a gentle giant that had finally been awoken. The loss was inevitable, and in that inevitability, Marco found a strange kind of peace. The question was no longer why they had lost. The new, burning question was, what could a man, armed with such a terrible and enlightening truth, build from the ashes of that defeat? Returning to the quiet order of the POW camp in Virginia, after the thunderous revelation of Willow Run, was like stepping from a raging storm into a library. The world-altering noise of the factory floor was gone, but it had been replaced by a different kind of intensity in Marco's mind, the quiet, relentless hum of new ideas. He and the other officers who had made the trip were changed men. They no longer walked with the slumped shoulders of the defeated, but with a strange new purpose. They had been given the answer to the great, painful question of their failure. Now, they were consumed by a new one. What to do with that knowledge? As it turned out, the American authorities would provide them with an unexpected path. In a remarkable and historically unique program, the U.S. government, in collaboration with American universities, began offering educational courses to Italian prisoners of war. It was a program born of a pragmatic desire to keep thousands of idle men occupied, but it would have consequences its creators likely never imagined. For Marco, the list of available courses was a map to a new world. Modern agricultural techniques, principles of industrial management, economics, and, most remarkably, American civics and the foundations of democracy. He enrolled with a hunger he had never felt for any formal education before. This was not about passing exams or earning a diploma. It was about survival and reconstruction. In the agricultural class, taught by a professor from a nearby land-grant university, he learned about soil conservation, crop rotation, and the efficient use of mechanized farm equipment concepts that were light years ahead of the near-feudal farming practices of his native Sicily. Every lecture about hybrid corn or diesel tractors was a direct, practical lesson he could apply to his father's land. He filled notebooks with diagrams and notes, seeing not just academic theories, but a clear, tangible path to lift his family out of the back-breaking poverty that had defined their existence for centuries. The greatest weapon, he realized, wasn't a 75mm cannon, but the knowledge of how to make a single acre of land produce 60 bushels of wheat instead of 20. The most transformative classes, however, were the ones on democracy. In a simple wooden classroom, surrounded by barbed wire, Marco learned about the radical ideas of checks and balances, a free press, an independent judiciary, and the consent of the governed. He read excerpts from the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. These were not the abstract, hollow slogans of fascism, which spoke of glory and destiny while demanding blind obedience. These were practical, architectural principles for building a society that protected the individual from the maxis, absolute power of the state. His internal conflict, the lingering shame of his defeat, and the anger at his betrayal finally found its resolution. He understood that true patriotism was not about dying for the mistakes of a dictator. True patriotism was about building a nation where a farmer's son would never again be sent to fight a modern industrial superpower with an obsolete tank and a heart full of lies. It was about creating a system that respected its citizens enough to trust them with the truth. His loyalty, he now understood, was not to a flag or a leader, but to the future of the Italian people. His mission had fundamentally shifted from destruction to creation. He was not alone. All around him, he saw this quiet revolution taking place in the minds of his fellow prisoners. Artillery officers who had once calculated firing solutions for their guns, now debated the economic theories of John Maynard Keynes. Infantry captains sketched out plans for small factories based on American production line principles. They were no longer Mussolini's soldiers. They were becoming the future engineers, agronomists, and entrepreneurs of a new Italy. The supreme irony of their situation was not lost on Marco. America, the enemy who had so decisively defeated them in battle, was now giving them the intellectual and practical tools to rebuild their nation. They were being armed by their captors, not with weapons of war, but with the very ideas that had made America so powerful in the first place. This was a form of conquest so subtle and profound that it didn't require a single shot to be fired. It wasn't about occupying land. It was about transforming minds. The Americans were not just winning the war. They were laying the groundwork for winning the peace, ensuring that the Italy that rose from the ashes of fascism would be an ally, not a future adversary. As 1944 turned into 1945, news from Europe became more frequent and more hopeful. The Allies were advancing through France, the Russians were closing in on Berlin, and the war in Italy, a brutal, grinding conflict, was nearing its end. The war was almost over. For millions across the globe, this meant the end of a long and bloody nightmare. But for Marco and the thousands of Italian prisoners of war who had spent years in America, it represented something else entirely. It was not an ending, but a commencement. The gates of the camp would soon open, and they would be sent home to a country that was not only physically shattered, but also spiritually broken. They were about to be repatriated into the heart of that devastation, but they would not be returning as defeated soldiers. They would be returning as pioneers, carrying a set of blueprints for a different kind of future. A future built not on the myth of steel, but on the power of an idea. The day Marco returned to his village in Sicily, he did not receive a hero's welcome. There were no parades, no triumphant arches. The war had bled his homeland dry, leaving behind a landscape of rubble and a people weary to their very bones. He stepped off the dusty bus and saw the familiar outlines of his home, but it was a place drained of its former life and color. He found his father in the fields, looking 10 years older than the last time he'd seen him, still wrestling a meager existence from the same exhausted soil. For a moment, a wave of despair washed over Marco. The knowledge he had gained in America, the vast factories, the endless fields of wheat, the principles of democracy, seemed like a fever dream, a cruel fantasy when confronted with the stark, unforgiving reality of post-war Italy. But the despair did not last. The seeds planted in the strange soil of his captivity had taken root too deeply. The next morning, he walked out into the fields with his father, but not just as a son returning to his duties. He was now a man with a plan. He began to speak of new ideas, strange concepts he had learned from a book in a Virginia classroom. He talked about contour plowing to prevent soil erosion, about rotating alfalfa with their wheat to replenish the nitrogen in the ground, about the possibility of pooling resources with their neighbors to collectively buy a small, second-hand tractor. His father, a man steeped in centuries of tradition and suspicion, listened with a skeptical eye. But he also saw the fierce, burning conviction in his son's face, a passion that was no longer the naive idealism of a young soldier, but the focused determination of an engineer. Slowly, cautiously, change began. It started small. Marco convinced a handful of neighboring farmers to try a new hybrid seed he had read about. When their harvest yielded significantly more than anyone else's, skepticism began to curdle into curiosity. The tractor, once a distant dream, became a shared community project. His was not an isolated story. Across the length of Italy, this quiet, grassroots transformation was being mirrored by tens of thousands of other returning prisoners of war. Men who had been captured as fascist soldiers were returning as agents of a democratic and industrial renaissance. Historians now speak of the Italian economic miracle, the period in the 1,950 seconds and 60 seconds when Italy, a nation left in ruins, experienced an astonishing explosion of economic growth. It is a complex phenomenon with many causes. Marshall Plan aid, a deep pool of skilled labor, and a flair for design and manufacturing. But it is impossible to ignore the contribution of this unique generation of men. The former artillery officer who returned to Milan and applied principles of mass production to build a scooter factory. The infantryman who brought back knowledge of modern canning techniques and revolutionized his local food processing industry. The tank gunner who transformed his family's ancestral farm into a modern agricultural enterprise. They were the human bridges, carrying the practical knowledge of the American system across the Atlantic and adapting it to the unique character of their homeland. They had lost the war, but in a profound and ironic twist of history, they became the key architects of Italy's victory in the peace that followed. The story of Marco and the M13/40, which began in the fire and dust of El Alamein, is therefore not a simple tale of military defeat. It is a timeless parable about the nature of true national strength. It demonstrates that a nation's power is not ultimately found in the thickness of its armor or the caliber of its guns, but in the freedom of its people, the dynamism of its economy, and the power of its ideas. The M13/40 was the product of a closed, authoritarian system built on a foundation of myth. It was rigid, obsolete, and fatally brittle. The M4 Sherman, and the industrial miracle that produced it, was the product of an open, democratic society, a system that, for all its messiness and perceived chaos, could innovate, adapt, and produce on a scale that totalitarian regimes could only dream of. The riveted steel of the Italian tank was no match for the resilient spirit of a free market and a democratic society. The experiences of these Italian tankers revealed an incredible truth. Sometimes, the most profound revelations don't come from victory, but from the bitter ashes of defeat. They were forced to look beyond the battlefield and witness firsthand the awesome power of a free economic system. It was a lesson paid for in blood, but it ultimately helped build a better, more prosperous world. But is that lesson still relevant in the 21st century? We now live in an age of new global rivalries, where different economic and political systems are once again competing for dominance. What do you believe is the ultimate source of a nation's strength today? Is it still the freedom and innovation of an open society? Or can centrally controlled systems create the next great breakthroughs? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What experiences or family stories do you have from this era that speak to this incredible transformation? Join the conversation and let us know. Thank you for watching.